Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those who need good afternoon. I hope you are well today. Welcome. I'm Zach. I'm serving as your chair for the Recharged Virtual Education Working Group. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. On behalf of the M4A leadership, everybody, we just like to say thanks and welcome. First webinar of the 2022-2023 school year. I'd also like to say, I was told to take the opportunities when they come. So to the PDI class of 2022, the first ever standalone class, we're here, especially any leader managers out there. I see you, we're here. Welcome to Peace of Mindfulness, Fortifying Your Mental Health Through Professional Boundary Setting. I'm here alongside Cecily, Rachel, and our Supervised Chair, Emily Howard, who will moderate the panel discussion after the presentation, and we will see you soon. Emily, go ahead and take us away, please.
Thank you, Zach. It is an absolute honor to serve in this role and be with you all here today for this important topic. We have a packed agenda for you all, starting with a presentation from our friends at the Community Impact Center, Clay Rojas and Ashley King. They will set the stage for us by defining what it means to set boundaries and how to do so can help support your mental well-being. After the presentation, we'll invite 3 industry panelists to join us for a discussion on setting and maintaining boundaries in the workplace. During the panel, we will have an opportunity to answer questions from our live audience. If you have any questions, you can submit them to our presenters and panelists using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen.
So at this time, we'd like to welcome our presenters. First up, Clay Rojas is a marriage and family therapist trainee pursuing licensure as a clinical counselor in California. He's a native of the San Francisco Bay Area. As founder and CEO of the Community Impact Center, his mission is to help people become the best version of themselves.
Our second presenter is Ashley King Nettle. She is the Community Impact Center's chief strategist. Every aspect of her work is founded in the power of human connection. She's a certified healing-centered engagement practitioner and has worked in the field of substance abuse prevention and youth development for over 15 years. She currently is in the process of becoming a chemical dependency counselor assistant. Clay and Ashley, thank you so much for being with us today.
Awesome. Thank you both.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Zach. All right, so Zach, I'm just gonna, when it's time to move slides, I'll just say, hey, next slide. So first, thank you again to everyone who's tuning in for this super important topic of setting healthy boundaries in the workplace. As mentioned before, my name is Clay Rojas, and I'm joined today by my chief strategist, Ashley King. And Zach, if you can go to the next slide, please. Just a little bit about the Community Impact Center. We are basically an organization that is 100% focused on mental health and mental wellness. We noticed that in the area where we started our company in Northern California, there was a huge gap between the mental health interventions that existed on campuses and the individuals that needed those services, particularly our Black and Brown community. And as most of you know, when a person, especially a student, a young person, doesn't see themselves represented outside of themselves, it can make them feel pretty invisible. So we started the Community Impact Center, and I started being very intentional about recruiting therapists and counselors and mentors from all different races, ethnicities, and backgrounds, different life stories, so that we could bring mental wellness with cultural relatability. And that's really the niche of our company. Next slide. So what we believe, I love the one thing about what we believe is vulnerability is earned. And that really ties in to what we're talking about today with setting healthy boundaries. But let me just touch on vulnerability really quick. We all serve in different capacities. Some of us on this call are supervisors. Some of us on this call have different job titles, but no matter what it is, we are all serving students, and we are all serving people. And I think a lot of times we walk into situations and we think that our job title is going to be the thing that will make a student become vulnerable with us. But I'm here to tell you that that's not the case. We are big believers that vulnerability is earned, right? So we have to earn the vulnerability of the students that we serve by being in the trenches with them, by spending time with them, and most importantly, by how we show up. How present are we when we're engaging with our students? And that's directly tied to the workplace boundaries that we set for ourselves. The healthier we are, the more present we can be for the students that we serve. So vulnerability is earned. We come in and we do mental wellness programs with high school and college athletes. We do a lock-in, we raise mental health ambassadors, and then we work with those mental health ambassadors all year long so that they can support their fellow teammates in getting the intervention and the interventions and the mental health systems, getting access to those on campus. So next slide. Here's the real question of the day. What happens when we reclaim healthy boundaries? We're going to talk a little bit about what is a healthy boundary. And, you know, I think if you were to ask 10 people what's a healthy boundary in the workplace, you might get 10 different answers. But here's what we believe. When you reclaim healthy boundaries, you reclaim your energy, you reclaim your time, and most importantly, you reclaim your peace. And I think that is such a huge benefit, just being able to be at peace when you're on your way to work, when you're at work, when you're driving home from work. I know so many people that wake up on Monday mornings and they dread going to work. And if that's you today, we want to give you some tips and some advice on how to get out of that area. But so many people dread going to work because they have unhealthy work boundaries and they don't want to be there. So we want to reclaim our peace. The result is that we're going to increase our emotional capacity and our bandwidth so that we can be more present for our colleagues, our student, and most importantly for ourselves. So we're gonna dive a little bit deeper into that. But next slide, first Ashley is gonna take us through a couple of questions.
Yeah, so we're going to do kind of a quick pulse check here. If you have this up on your laptop, get out your phone and scan this, and there's a 2-question quiz. If you want to use another tab on your laptop, I just go to menti.com. I just put it in the chat, menti.com, and then type in this code and answer those 2 questions. We're going to just give like literally just 30 seconds. If you are driving, please don't worry about this. We will share the results. And then so we're literally 30 seconds here. And Zach, if you could get ready to share those results in a minute, that would be great. All right, so I'll just talk this through. The first question is on a scale of 1 to 10, you know, how do you feel at the end of your workday? And then there's 5 other questions. Then the next question is, where are we struggling with boundaries? See a few results coming in. If you have a question, feel free to type it in the chat if it's not working. All right. Let's see, give about 10 more seconds. It's all right if not everyone does it. We're gonna do our best. All right, Zach, if you wanna go ahead and share that screen then, that would be great.
Yeah, I think some people were saying it's showing a different question.
There's 2, okay. Let's see. So there's 2 questions. If you should be able to advance it, if not, it's okay, we'll just roll with what we have. If you see on your screen, it might be in the bottom, there's a way to advance it to the next. Again, it's all right if we don't get to it, we'll do our best. All right, Zach, do we have that? All right, so that is not the results one. Let me see if I can share. All right, so what we have here, so Zach, that's not showing up on your screen, so I'll just tell the results. Okay, so on a scale of 1 to 10, feeling appreciated is where we're feeling the best. 6.6 out of 10 are feeling appreciated. Where we're lacking right now at the end of the workday, looks like we're lacking energy. So that's where we are on the scale of 1 to 10. That seems to be the group consensus, lacking energy at the end of the day. All right, let's see. So the next one is, and you should, if you're on your phone, you should be able to see the results too. All right, where are we struggling with boundaries the most? And right now it's supervisors and then myself, those self-imposed boundaries. All right, so that's our temperature check for the day. All right, the results keep coming and we can circle back to the end. But all right, thanks everyone for letting us get a room check on that. All right, let me pass it back over to Clay. Clay, you're muted.
All right, we'll keep engaging with those questions, but we're going to jump right into benefits of effective workplace boundaries. So what happens when we are able to set healthy boundaries in the workplace? The first thing that I want to touch on is increased emotional capacity. Again, this is one of those terms that's a pretty loaded term, and I think it's open to interpretation. So I want to set a precedent here for purposes of this talk and this webinar, that emotional capacity is a measure of your ability to overcome limiting beliefs, to overcome your ease, or to help you ease into adapting to challenging situations, and then to help you adapt and to increase the quality of your relationships. And I think that many of us who are struggling emotionally find it really hard to show up to work and have meaningful engagement, not just with our peers or our supervisors, but most importantly, with the students that we serve. I think we're operating under a lot of stress. We're working with a lot of students who are post-pandemic. Right now, many freshmen and sophomores in college are those exact same kids that were in lockdown. Some of those kids are now manifesting much of the trauma that they accumulated during the pandemic and the lockdown. And we're seeing a huge increase in the need for mental health support. So a lot of these students are coming to us for help, because oftentimes the wait list to go see a counselor is extremely long. So they're going to come to you, and you're going to wear many different hats in your position. And in order to effectively wear many different hats, you're going to have the capacity for stress. You're going to have the capacity to be flexible. You're going to have the mental capacity and the emotional capacity to put your own things to the side so that you can be present for your own students. So that's the first thing that's going to happen. When you set the healthy boundary in the workplace, you're going to increase your emotional capacity, which is huge. The second thing that's going to happen is you're going to increase your bandwidth. So you guys can type a yes or a no in the chat, but how many of you have shown up to work, or your boss walks into your office and your boss might say to you, do you have any bandwidth for a project? Do you have any bandwidth for an additional task? What your boss is really asking you is it okay to add an additional work project to what you're already doing without compromising your work? All right. So when you increase your bandwidth, that means that you are able to take on more tasks without compromising the work that you are already engaged in. And oftentimes when we go to a partner or to a peer in the workplace, and we ask them, do you have the bandwidth to take on this additional thing? Oftentimes, I'm seeing a little bit in the chat room, oftentimes you're not even given a choice. Sometimes your boss is going to walk into the office and say, we have this additional project and here's the deadline. And now you're sitting at your desk trying to process all the things you're already working on, and now something else just got added to your plate. So this is exactly what happens when we don't have the bandwidth and we don't have the emotional capacity to handle these things. These things directly impact, whether you believe it or not, your lack of emotional capacity and your lack of bandwidth in the workplace directly impacts the way you show up for your students. They can tell when you're stressed out. They can tell when you walk into a classroom. They can tell when they walk into your office if you are at burnout or if you're just at normal stress. So, stress is when your bucket is full. Burnout is your bucket is broken. And when a student walks into your office to talk about something that they're going through and you are at burnout or at high stress, it makes it extremely difficult for you to show up. And it's all about how we show up for our students, guys. It's all about how we're showing up for them. Again, vulnerability is not something that's just given. A student is not going to be vulnerable with you just because you're a counselor, or because you have 3 letters behind your name or your title. Vulnerability is earned. And in order for us to earn the vulnerability that we desire from our students and those that we serve, we have to increase our emotional capacity. We have to increase our bandwidth. You have to be the most present person in that office when the student knocks on your door and they walk in and they have some life-changing event that just happened to them. You have to be present for them. In some of these circumstances, we're talking about life and death. Next slide. So, healthy boundaries. Let's just get down to the nuts and bolts of this thing. Healthy, and by the way, we are going to send all of our speaking notes and all of these talking points over to N4A, and we're going to make this all available for you. So don't feel like you have to take all the notes. But healthy boundaries are guidelines, rules, or limits that a person creates to identify for themselves what is reasonable. Okay, what's reasonable here? What is psychologically safe? And what are permissible ways for other people to behave around you? That's a lot, right? So when I'm setting my boundaries in the workplace, I am creating a space for myself to know and to recognize when something is off, whether that be someone's behavior, whether it is not being respected, whether it means that you have to define to your coworkers and to your superiors and even to your subordinates, what is psychologically safe, what is permissible, what is reasonable. All those things are not easy to do, especially when you come in new to a company and you're kind of the low man on the totem pole or low woman on the totem pole. It's hard, but healthy work boundaries maintain your safety. They maintain your physical and emotional health. And according to Esther Perel, who's a lady that I followed that talks a lot about workplace boundaries, she says that the most important definition of a boundary is it's about connection and it's about separateness. In other words, we are working in an environment where there is a collective, shared, inspired vision, but at the same time, independence is celebrated. That's when you know that you're in a healthy place. Next slide. So what are some practical tips? Here's like some really quick takeaways that you can start using today. If you feel like you're in a place where you don't have healthy work boundaries, the number one thing that you should start with is review your job description. Let me just say this, though, about reviewing job description, because I think it's super important. Yes, review your job description, but please don't become a person who is going to lock into your job description and you're not going to be willing to go outside of that from time to time to help a friend, to help a colleague, to help the inspired mission and vision of the company. I've seen people where, you may be asked a simple task and you might say, well, that's not in my job description, so I'm not going to do that. I've actually seen that happen in the workplace. It's pretty divisive. So there has to be a balance between you setting your workplace boundaries and what I would like to say, just cultural humility. There has to be a sense of humility when we're reviewing our job descriptions and when we're setting our boundaries. The other thing is to check in with yourself, right? Check in with yourself. Like, how are you really feeling at the end of the workday? How are you really feeling when you're driving to work? Are you truly in a place where you feel like you're respected, where you are acknowledged, where you have that inner peace when you're in the workplace? Do you love what you do? And then communicate before bad habits set in. One of the number one keys to establishing healthy workplace boundaries is to communicate. And a lot of times it's hard to communicate, again, when you're just coming in brand new to a company. And there, in some companies, there could be a culture of hierarchy, and you're not very high up there, and you want to be the superstar. You want to say yes to everything. I understand that, and I understand wanting to do good, but you have to communicate when your boundaries are crossed. And there's a way to do it professionally, and there's a way to do it with humility that I think will go a lot farther than in some other unhealthy ways that I've seen in the workplace before. Next slide. Here's 3 more. Maintain healthy work relationships. All right. That's saying a lot, but for me, in a nutshell, what that means is that you are a person who sees your coworkers as more than just coworkers. You see them as people. You're not respecting people because they have a title, but you're respecting people because you're just going to practice kindness and respect. I think that a lot of times people respect another person because of their job title, and that's okay. But I think when you can begin to see people as people, you start creating those healthy work relationships. The other one is take time off. Self-care is not selfish. So if you need time off, take it. A lot of people feel guilty about taking time off. And then the other one is learn to say no. It's hard sometimes. And I know that sometimes we want to be the superstar and we want to do everything and we want to shine, but learning to say no in a humble way will go a long way. Next slide. And I think Ashley, you got it from here.
All right, so I'm just going to dig a little bit deeper here. So the theory of change, we know that change starts with knowledge. So if we know that stress has an adverse effect on our mental, emotional, physical health, then it's our choice to, what's our attitude about it then? If our attitude is then, I want to prioritize my mental wellness and health, then the next step is behavior, the boundary, is creating that change. And so what does that look like? We're talking about practical applications. That might mean scheduling that daily, weekly time for you. I know that we hear that a lot, but it's really, yes, really get on your calendar and make those changes. Make that recurring meeting with yourself. Review your calendar. Edit it. There was, I don't know if anyone else follows Gary Vee. You can put it in the chat if you do. He had a great video a few weeks ago about what are these meetings that we're having that could really be essentially micro meetings. And so instead of having a 30-minute meeting, 45 to 60-minute meeting, could that be a 10-minute meeting or a 15-minute meeting? And it's not disrespectful, it's respecting people's time. And it's now saying, I'm opening up my bandwidth to maybe talk with a few more people, or maybe, just being more respectful of time. So consider what the micro meeting could do to your calendar. Again, share expectations with all the people that you're talking to. If they don't know your boundary, we can't expect people to recognize it if we're not communicating it with them. And that might be, sometimes we see in people's email signatures, it says, kind of like responding from iPhone, please excuse, typos. Well, it's totally appropriate to include, what your boundary is for responding to emails. Is it, I'll respond to emails between 8 and 5, and then also include maybe an emergency protocol so that there's, flexibility if something is really happening. But just kind of putting it out there so that people are aware of what is okay with you. And I know that a lot of you don't work 8 to 5 schedules. I know you all are really busy, but I think it's okay to find a boundary that works for you and then communicate that. So we'll go to the next slide, Zach. So culture of change. I know some people, a lot of us will think, well, yeah, I could make that change, but the culture I'm in, it's not going to accept it. That's fair. It is hard to shift a culture. And so I'm talking about your department, your office, maybe your own team. So that's going to take time. I get that. But maybe what you can do is start within yourself to build a you that you want to live in. So first it's you, and then you build that culture. And so you can be that kind of proof of concept. Like, here you are working within these boundaries, and it's working and it's effective. So that's, I know culture change takes time. So let's start with you and then build out from there. 2023, a new year, is a great time to start these new things because people are expecting people to make some changes. And so what a great opportunity to say, okay, this is when I'm going to institute these new boundaries, and then communicate that. I talk to my kids about having this skyscraper version of ourselves. What is that? Think of ourselves as this, 40-story skyscraper. If I'm thinking the best version of myself, where am I starting? And I ask my kids, and they say, well, Mom, if you're building 40 stories, you're going to start at story 1. And I'm like, you know what? That makes a lot of sense. But actually, I got to start by digging that foundation. I got to go deeper. And so that's when we have to say, if I want this change, I got to look within and do that in myself first. And that can be hard, because who we were That doesn't have to be who we are or who we're looking to be in the present. Let's go to the next slide, Zach. Thank you. So here's the challenge, though, is that change is uncomfortable. The boundaries are going to require conversations. They're not going to be easy. Haters are going to hate. Personal story, I had to make a change in my personal life and let some family members know some boundaries. On Mother's Day of this year, someone gave me a Mother's Day card with a family picture on it. On the front, it's a picture of us from a few years ago. And then the inside said, I miss this Ashley. And when I first saw that, I was so mad. I thought, that is so disrespectful. And then I realized, you know what? This person didn't know that Ashley was struggling because I didn't communicate that. But now I have set that boundary, and that's hard for them. But I know that that's what I need to do for myself to maintain that, a healthy lifestyle, to maintain, a health and wellness culture for my children. And so I'm going to stay in my lane, even though that was uncomfortable. And it is a little bit uncomfortable because I know that my mental health and wellness and that of my children's is worth it because the cost of inaction is too great. All right, next slide, Zach. So I'm going to leave with this. Consider this. I know that sometimes, a few weeks ago, I was laying in bed and I just felt the weight, some heavy stuff on my shoulders. And when we feel that, that's an obvious sign that something's going on, right? We know that 90% of illness and disease is stress related or exacerbated by stress. We know that life expectancy in the US is now decreasing, and that's not just because of the pandemic. There's other things happening in our lives. So we need to really be aware of how stress is affecting us. And what's even sneakier to me is when we go through something and then we release it and we go, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize that I was carrying that burden. An example, kind of mama story here. My son is going into kindergarten in 2020. And so from March 2020 to September 2020, I'm stressing about this. He's been in speech therapy for years and I'm thinking he's got to wear a mask. No one's going to understand him. I'm thinking all this stuff about my little boy starting kindergarten. He starts kindergarten and it's fine. He's fine. And I realized there was a physical change in how I was. I didn't realize that I was carrying that burden around and what that was doing to me physically. I didn't realize that I had that on me until it left. And so we need to really reflect on what are these things that we don't even realize that we are carrying, that we are bearing the weight of, that aren't ours to carry, or things that we just need to reflect on and really address so that we can shed that weight, so that we can be that skyscraper version of ourselves and for the students that we're serving, and for our families and friends. So I'm going to leave us there, take it back to Clay to just go over some review to summarize this.
All right, so just to summarize and wrap this thing up, here's the takeaways and here's the things we want you to work on as we wrap up today. What are healthy boundaries? Take this new year to define that for yourself. If you don't define it for yourself, if you don't write it down on paper, you're probably not going to do it. It's going to require intentionality. And why are your boundaries important? Burnout and high stress is going to start taking a toll on your physical and mental health. And that is not just going to take a toll on you as a person, but it's also going to start impacting the people you serve. Number two, what is emotional capacity and how do you increase that? Number three, what is bandwidth and how do you increase that? We gave you guys the practical steps, and you have to be intentional about doing this thing. I love the slide that says, what is the cost of inaction? And for those of you who are already tapped out, who are already burned out, who are already stressed, I really want you to reflect and ask yourself, if I don't make a change in 2023, how is that going to impact my mental health, my physical health, my job, and most importantly, the students that I serve? So thank you guys for listening. I think we're going to move into a panel now. We're sending notes over to the team so that you guys have a lot of these talking points and slides. And if you all have any other questions, our contact information will be made available to you, as well as further professional development. Thank you, guys.
Wow, Clay and Ashley, thank you so much for sharing this information. There are some incredible nuggets in there, and I know there are some things I'm going to take with me into 2023 as well. I'm excited to bring in our featured panelists to help continue the discussion about boundary setting and what it looks like specifically in student athlete services. However, before I introduce our panelists, I would love to hear from our audience about your experience with boundary setting. On your screen, there's going to be a quick poll. If you could please answer the questions for our panelists to provide some additional context of who's with us today, we would very much appreciate it. As we have the poll up, I'm going to start introducing our panelists. Our first panelist is Dr. Dani Pekar. Dr. Pekar is the Director of Student Athlete Mental Health Services at Bowling Green State University. She is a licensed professional clinical counselor, and her doctorate in sports psychology, her doctorate is in sport performance psychology. Dr. Pekar joined BGSU in October of this year. She is working with collegiate mental health, or she has been working in collegiate mental health for 5 years and has an experience as a clinical staff supervisor at previous institutions. In her current role, Dani provides mental health counseling and mental performance services to Division I student athletes and teams.
Thank you, Emily. Our next panelist is Courtney Hoffman. Courtney has been working as a learning specialist and academic counselor for over 8 years. She has worked at schools across the country, both big and small, public and private, and she currently works at the University of Michigan. She's serving as also the chair of the SAW committee. She's very active in M4A, and we appreciate that. And she teaches yoga on the side. So that's Courtney.
And last but not least, our final panelist is Penny Samaya. Penny is in his 18th year in student athlete development, all at the University of Pittsburgh. He grew up in Utica, New York, and attended Pitt as a student athlete. He credits his professional growth to his experiences serving on committees and task forces within the NCAA, in N4A, and in other organizations, as well as learning and collaborating from lifelong learners, educators, mentors, and students. Panelists, thank you so much for being with us today. If you don't mind turning on all of your cameras, that way you can all be on our screens. Awesome.
And then we'll just give a brief pause of about 15 more seconds because I see people submitting the webinar questions still. All right, thumbs up.
All right, awesome. Thank you all so much for sharing this information. I think it'll help provide some additional context for our panelists. So I would love to start off with some questions for our panelists. To start us off, if Penny, if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to hear about what boundary setting looks like for you in the professional space.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, hello to all my N4A peeps. It is so great and an honor to be here with you all. And thank you for allowing me some time to be in your presence and in your space and sharing it with you. So for me, when it comes to understanding what boundaries are, especially in a professional setting, I really love what Clay had to say, especially with knowing yourself. You know, one thing I'm very transparent about and really am open with is also knowing my own vulnerability. So Clay, knowing that vulnerability is earned, I love that. And I want to share a vulnerable moment with you all on me and what I needed to help me align with my own boundaries. And it started in 2018. You know, from my health, I was not in the best place. In 2019, it ended up putting me in a hospital where I was really, I was down. And I had to really refocus a lot of my priorities in life. And I was planning to get married that year. And what it did, it kept me going on this journey of just consciousness and understanding me, understanding what I needed. You know, I'm such a servant person, you know, that's what I've been doing my entire life, that this was a moment where I needed to pause. And let me tell you, N4A, my brothers, my sisters, my peoples, my friends, you can pause to focus on you. We are all servants in this space, but don't neglect you. And because of that, I needed to redial in on my own priorities in life, my own boundaries, and I established those boundaries. The beauty of what establishing those is I also have been very fortunate to have a team and a great unit who understands both me and each other. And because of the long history of culture that we've been able to develop within our unit, I've been able to share with them where I am in my life journey, where I am in my boundaries, and share willingly. And what it's turned into is just tremendous support from my team. So as a practitioner, even in an elevated space, we all need help. We all need help. And it's one of those things that we need to first start with is who we are and our own needs.
Yeah, thank you so much, Penny, for being willing to share all of that with us. I could definitely imagine that that would be a wake-up call to really focus in on those boundaries. If any of our other panelists want to chime in on what that looks like for you to actually physically set the boundaries in the space, feel free to chime in as well.
Well, let me apologize. I presented twice before this, so I'm conscious of time limits. So if you need me to expand, I'm happy to. But when it came to that, I did mention understanding and knowing who I am, what I need, but also being willing and able to communicate that and make those necessary changes for you. Once you communicate that, you also need to understand who you need to communicate your boundaries with. For me, it was with my direct supervisors, the teams and units I was a part of. I'm also a part of the exec team. But most importantly, my leaders who are in my unit. You know, I got a very, very good team who are just so talented, and I trust them wholeheartedly. And what that afforded me was the grace of letting go of worries and strain and being able to trust the talents of our team to execute at a high level. So that is something very important as well.
Thank you so much for sharing that. As we go into our next question, I'd love to direct this one to Dr. Pekar. We talked a little bit about once we have set these boundaries, part of it is going to be making them a priority, right? Not only are we saying them, but we're acting them. So how would you recommend to practitioners that they could really prioritize their well-being through this act of setting boundaries?
Thanks, and thanks for inviting me to be on the panel. I think boundaries are really important when we're looking at our mental health and physical health, especially as Clay and Ashley said. And I think it's one of those things that we talk about, and it's very easy to talk about and very easy to be like, yes, boundaries, love them. Putting them into practice is a whole nother story, especially when we talk about, you know, the bulk of us being on here, I think almost all of us being on here from the athletic space where it's very fast paced. There's a lot of expectations and we go all of the time. So I think the very first step in boundary setting is genuine self-reflection for yourself. I think having an honest conversation with yourself about what do I actually need? What is actually valuable for me and for my energy is a really important thing, because if we're not genuine, we're going to be setting boundaries that don't necessarily fulfill our needs. So I would, whether you're a journaler or like you have a close family friend that you can have these discussions with, or a professional, that you have an open dialogue of what is it that I need, and a reflection on your value systems. And then I would put whatever kind of reminders you need, whether they're sticky notes in your office, right? Got them everywhere and they're like basically free. So put those sticky notes everywhere that you need that remind yourself, whether it's an inspirational phrase, whether it's something that says, I am my priority is one of my favorites to go to remind yourself, like maybe it's right on your desktop computer. So that every time you answer an email, it's like, I am the priority that you remind yourself for. So things that, you know, kind of from a personal standpoint that I like, and this kind of goes into the question that Penny did so well answering, is looking at what your needs are personally. So I am a natural introvert, yet as a counselor and somebody in athletics, right, I'm pushed to be an extrovert and I embrace that part of myself. And yet, you know, I need my downtime. So some of my things are like at my lunch hours, my door closes, right? Because that's my quiet time and that helps me recharge for my afternoons. So things like that you can easily do that don't necessarily change the job description if that's not available right now. Don't necessarily flex your work hours if that's not available to you, because everybody's schedules are different. What small things can you do during the day that start to work towards your needs and your values and boundary setting? It doesn't have to be big changes in boundaries. They can be very small things that you can implement day by day.
Thank you so much for sharing all of those practical options. I agree with Ashley that the sticky notes are everywhere, and the making sure to remind yourself that you are physically a priority. I think that's such a poignant reminder. Courtney, did you want to jump in as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I'd like to extend my thanks to all of you for having me. I'm incredibly humbled to be here with all of you. I think one of the big things, it's we talk about, like prioritizing your well-being with boundary setting. And I think one of the big things is, all of the technology that we use all of the time, that's actually one of the ways that you can prioritize your boundary setting. For those of us, because, there's definitely two camps, right? You are either an iPhone person or you are not. But on the iPhone, for those of us that for the home game, the do not disturb setting, do not disturb is huge. I think it's absolutely massive. I tell my students all the time, look, I'm willing to give you until 9 or 10 o'clock at night when study table ends. Much past that, friends, you've had hours during the day to just shoot me a quick text. And I think it's just kind of being really realistic about your schedule and being really realistic about what it is that you need. I make it a point, also I think what's important too, on the weekends, right? Emails on the weekends. Can I turn off my notifications on the weekends? Those kinds of things. Like Saturday, it tends to be game day. I don't want to check my email on a Saturday morning, right? I don't want to check my email on a Sunday morning. That's not how I want to start my weekend morning. And so I think it's sort of being mindful of those habits that we get into during the week. Don't necessarily have to apply to the full 7 days of our week. And I think it's incredibly important for us also to realize, the beautiful functionality about a laptop is once you close the lid, it goes away, right? Like it turns off. And so, you can mute things, all of that. So I think, trying to prioritize, when we're talking about priorities and particularly when it comes to your wellness, the technology that we use so often with students and the technology that we rely on, that's actually one of the ways that you can prioritize things. I think the other thing that's really important to do, is just sort of understand, okay, is this a right now problem, right? I think everybody has seen those memes, right? Is this a January problem or is this a right now problem? And so sort of kind of, really taking a step back, right? Take that 30,000 foot view, to even take the 3,000 foot view of something and just say, does this have to be solved right now? Or can I put this aside for a moment when I'm in a better mental space or when I'm in a better place to really put my heart and soul into it.
Courtney, thank you so much. And something that you mentioned that Clay also talked about is about clarity of your boundaries, that you are actually physically telling people, your students in this scenario, that this is when I'm going to stop communicating. And I think it's Brene Brown who says, clear is kind. And I love that, right? That if we are being clear about the things that our expectations, the things that we want, we can help, let everybody know how they can treat us, which is what we were talking about earlier. So thanks for sharing that. Just a quick reminder to everyone in the audience, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions you might have for our presenters and panelists. Jumping into the next question, Penny, you had mentioned that you support a large staff, which is phenomenal. You're doing some incredible stuff over at Pitt. And I'd love to hear from a supervisory perspective, how you support the boundaries of the people who report up to you. And how do you encourage them to set their boundaries and then respect them once they've been communicated to you?
Thanks for that prompt, Emily. First and foremost, relationships are so important. We hired these individuals. We brought them in. We saw value in them, that we wanted them to be a part of our team. So let's make sure we take care of them. So building relationships on a one-on-one is very, very important. And then continuing that, how do you navigate a large team or just being a part of a team? Well, one, when you get to know each other, you get to understand people's ins and outs. So the first thing I love to do is observe. I'm very observant, especially with the type of year, not the type of year, but the last 2 to 3 years in our industry of what's happened, how things have been navigated, all the things we haven't faced before. So being observant of people's behaviors and actions and identifying is something a little off. Once I peep one of my team members off in their actions and behaviors, I immediately want to just check on them. I gotta check on them. I gotta say, hey, is everything all right with you? And if I don't recognize it, I'll ask somebody who does, who works with them. Secondly, is that ask part. We gotta step up and ask. If these people are coming to work with us and for us at certain points, we got to make sure we take care of them and we can help fulfill any needs that we can help fulfill. Third piece is listening. One of the things I absolutely love to do, and I'm going to call my dear friend and team member, our assistant AD, Kelsey Scher, on this. In our one-on-ones, I always ask her, is there anything I could do for you to help be a better leader? And she gave me such great feedback. And I shared it this morning with the group. I'll share with you all. She said, Penn, if you can just help me by doing one of these two things, if you can follow through or delegate, that would help me tremendously. And I've listened. I've heard her, and I'm working on it as a leader. But that was her boundary on setting. I needed to make sure that I listen and I'm activated in that. And the last part is the one-on-one meetings. Having those one-on-ones with your team members so you can, again, build that relationship, get to know them, and that will help strengthen your observations and their actions and behaviors as they navigate through that space. What can I do? What can I do to help them? It's all about elevating people with growth, not trying to keep something status quo. So for me, that's super important, and respecting other people's boundaries. And then repeating that outwardly amongst your peers, amongst your team units. I do collective groupthink amongst my leaders. I have a leadership group that I meet for our unit, and I bounce ideas and thoughts off of them, and we bounce it off of each other, and then we bring that to everyone. That's super important to me because that's shared governance, if you will, or shared leadership space.
Yeah, I'm 100% Team Penny on this for sure. I mean, one thing for me is normalizing those conversations, from the get-go. Like you're saying, Penny, like when you have those weekly check-ins or whatever it is, you keep, pouring into that. And along with that is motivating what motivates your people. Example of, one person on my team is highly motivated by her family. Yes, this is a workplace, but what motivates her in life is her family. And so I know that, and I respect, I'm checking in with her. What's going on with your fam? Oh, she likes to talk about that. And so I know that when she goes home for the day, that her family is where she needs to be. This is her boundary. And I don't want to disrespect her boundary. And she works really hard during the day. And I respect that. And I respect that when she goes home, that's her time for family. And when we do that, when we pour in and show that care, when there are those times where maybe we're asking a little bit more, we're kind of that gray area of the boundary, maybe, maybe it's finals week, something's going on, for us, and it's like the grant world, you got a grant due, then those people who you have poured in that trust and that you have really worked, cared about their motivating factors, they'll be more willing to say, you know what, hey, I got this, Eve. Let me help you out a couple hours. I got this. And so it's just building into your team so that when those times do come, when you really do, when it's a now problem, not a January problem, they're willing to be like, all right, I get you. And you pour in that appreciation to say, hey, I know this is not ideal. Thank you for that. And so it's normalizing these conversations, respecting what motivates them, and then just giving that trust so that when you do need the extra help, they'll be more willing to engage.
I love that you both have sort of brought up the relationship building piece of all of this, because this is a skill that as people who work with student athletes, we're doing every day with our student athletes. We are so focused on making sure that we are learning the most about them. And I love that that is something that you're translating into working with your people who report to you, so that way you can also know what motivates them and what energizes them and how you can best support them, just like we do with our student athletes. So I love that line there. I'm going to wrap up with our last question before we open to the audience, and I'm going to direct this one to Courtney, but anyone feel free to chime in. We talked a little bit about how supervisors can help their direct reports establish and keep their boundaries, but how do you share those boundaries and realistic expectations with your supervisors and key partners, especially when it comes to your workload? And if you're reaching capacity, as we sort of talked about earlier, how do you respectfully decline different projects and things like that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So anyone who has ever worked sort of as a learning specialist will often tell you, right? Sometimes you feel as though you are standing there, right? You are your own sort of Statue of Liberty, and you're standing there, book in hand, torch up, saying, please send me your problem children, send me your behavior issues, send me your, send me all these things. And you sort of feel like you end up becoming this, for lack of a better term, you become a dumping ground for the students that other people don't want to work with. And I think it's sort of, it's having the conversation of, saying, look, I can't fix an eligibility concern because this kid isn't going to class. Working with me isn't going to fix that for you. Right. And so again, I think it's sort of reevaluating, okay, what am I really supposed to be doing when I'm working with students, and having the conversations with your coworkers and or your supervisors to say, this, I recognize that not everybody necessarily understands what it is a learning specialist does, or it's not necessarily clear, but this is really what I'm trying to do with students. And this is what I, kind of like, again, going back to that job description, going back to, this is really why I'm here. I just want to make sure that we're all staying on the same page with that. Of course, I'm going to help a student. I will help a student till I'm blue in the face with, with reading issues or, whatever. We'll go through a lot of those things. But again, I think it's important to sort of make sure that everybody really knows why it is you were there as a learning specialist, and or why it is you were there in your particular position. I think then that way you don't necessarily have to respectfully decline, because I think once you've had that honest conversation to say, I appreciate you thinking I'm really, really good at this, but babysitting, I stopped doing that when I was a teenager, right? I was young. I've stopped doing it now. And so I think it's just being very sort of upfront, saying, this is why I'm really here. This is what I really want to do. And absolutely, I'm a part of this team, and absolutely, I want to help. But there's certain things that just fall outside of my purview that I can't necessarily do. And so I think for me, I haven't had, I've been very, very blessed. I've worked for, some of whom are on this call, so I appreciate all of you. But, I think what's happened is that, because I'm able to have that honest conversation, you don't necessarily have to respectfully decline, because if people then have that moment of realization, like, oh, right, not okay. Yes, you aren't the dumping ground. You are not, because again, it also, and I don't mean to ramble on, but I do think the other thing that happens sometimes is, as a learning specialist or someone that works in that capacity, you feel as though you have to have all of the answers. You feel as though you have to have an answer because somebody is coming to you, and then and then once you feel like you have to have an answer and you have to solve everybody's problems, any boundaries that you were trying to set immediately go away, because you constantly feel like you have to try to fix, and you constantly feel like you have to try to solve. And so when you sort of take yourself and put yourself out of that mentality of saying, no, this isn't my problem to solve, or this isn't my responsibility to take on, then it becomes much easier to not only have the other, the prior conversations that we were talking about, but it also still lets you feel as though you were part of the team, and makes sure that everybody knows that you are still a part of that team.
Yeah, and I agree with everything Courtney said here, and to just kind of piggyback off of it, I think it's important when we're in spaces, especially if we're talking to a supervisor or maybe somebody who's outside of our space, we don't always speak the same language. And I can speak to this personally as a mental health professional in the athletic space in a brand new position, right? This position didn't exist before me. And so not everybody speaks mental health. And so when talking to others and setting boundaries and communicating what it is that I do, it's important to speak in a language that is going to be heard. And we're all here for the same reason, right? We're all here to serve student athletes and help student athletes live fulfilling lives in whatever way that looks like for them. And so if we can speak that language when we're setting boundaries and connect on that shared vision, I think that's going to go a long way when you're talking to a supervisor or somebody from outside the office who might not understand it is what exactly that you do. And just like a couple of practical tools I'm going to throw out there, counselor, that might be helpful. Like if you're talking to a supervisor, I am going to put some reflection questions in the chat for everybody. But even simple things such as like using I statements when you're setting your boundaries. Often when we hear like, you don't appreciate me, other person's going to eventually like automatically take a step back and be like, whoa. And that can become like more conflictual. But if you have that, I don't feel appreciated in my current position, that comes off very different. Person on the receiving end is going to be much more likely to hear you. I would also encourage, like, if these are open dialogues, and often these conversations take time to build, and these boundaries take repetition to put into place. Try not to get discouraged when that happens, because any type of feedback or dialogue that happens means the person you're talking to is hearing something, right? It might not be exactly what you want and exactly what you intend, but they're engaged in some way. And that can be a positive sign that growth is going to happen. So continuing to be consistent with your boundaries, just like we tell student athletes, right? If they're going to learn a physical skill, they practice, and eventually they get it. And so for yourself, not to get discouraged if you try to set a boundary and it doesn't go the way that you had hoped that very first time. All right. It's a time to evaluate and go at it again. Right. And continuing those open dialogues and reminding yourself that you are worth the time and energy it takes to set boundaries. You are absolutely worth it.
Yes, I feel like it needs to be repeated. You are worth setting the boundaries. Oh, that was such a great way to wrap up that question. That was phenomenal. Thank you all so much for all of your insight and for sharing some of this really vulnerable information. And I want to really quick highlight something that Ashley said again earlier. This stuff is not easy, right? Like setting boundaries, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes, working with people on what you mean by being clear and repeating things. So I just want to, thank you all for joining us and talking about this today. We do have a couple of questions in Q&A. So I'm going to ask Rachel Rodriguez and Cecily Taylor, who are both members of the Virtual Ed Working Group, to join us to ask some of our audience questions. So if you have others, you can definitely use the Q&A feature and we'll try to get to as many as we can before we need to wrap up. So Cecily and Rachel, you can take it away.
All right. Good morning / afternoon. I know Penny did type an answer for our first question, but I'm still going to announce it and see if anybody else has anything to say or add on to it. But first question is, how do you bring others with you on setting boundaries and supporting those boundaries?
So I'm happy to answer this verbally as well as writing in there. So Andrea, great question. From my perspective, communication is super important. Again, that's what the precursor. Make sure you have certain knowledge of your relationships with the people you need to communicate with, recognizing what type of relationship you have, and being effective in how you communicate to them. So for example, sometimes we get caught up in a way we need to say something, that we want to say something, but we also need to recognize how is that going to be received by the recipients. So knowing and understand who you're speaking with. Sometimes when you want to deliver a message, you need to deliver it in a way that they'll hear you, not always the way we want to deliver it. And the same when we receive things, when we receive information, we receive feedback, sometimes we have to listen to the person's intent and heart instead of the method in which they're delivering it. And that's hard. It's really hard to separate from times without practicing it. But I highly encourage understanding, at least from your control and ownership, of how to best communicate things, and find a confidant who you trust that you can bounce those ideas off of. Someone to give you real feedback, someone that may say, hey, pause, Andrea, that might be a little rough, or pause, that might be coming in a little bit too wishy-washy, and it may not be as clear. So that practice piece is super important.
Penny, thank you so much. Anyone else wanted to chime in on that? We do have one more question that I will share. So obviously, we're not mental health counselors, a lot of us academic advisors or student athlete development professionals. And so someone actually posed, one of the attendees in the Q&A, that they struggle to use things like do not disturb because they're worried a student will reach out to them during an emergency. So they feel a bit guilty if they're not available, if that were to happen. So how would you all recommend going about this and kind of navigating those feelings and being able to still set the boundaries?
Rachel, I was actually, it was funny because I wrote this comment down on a piece of paper as all this conversation was going on. We have to learn how to silence the inner critic. There is this thing in our culture that makes us feel guilty for taking care of ourselves. Again, if you're in a space where you don't have the emotional capacity or the bandwidth, even if your door is open, even if your phone is on, you're not going to be effective in delivering the help that your student needs anyway. So if you know that you're in that space of like burnout or high stress, or you're bound, you need to shut down anyway. That's why we have teams. That's why we have, other people in other spaces that can pick up the slack. And this is the importance of going back to relationships, right? Because I know if Penny's struggling or, Ashley or whatever, I know that I'm going to step in. So I would say this is a huge one. We have to learn how to silence the inner critic. that tells us that it's not okay, that others must come first. But just like on the airplane, right? You got to put on your own mask before you help somebody else.
And if I may, I because I'm the one that brought up do not disturb and things, but I think something else to think about too is, what is that student defining as an emergency? Right? Because, again, their really poor planning does not constitute an emergency on my part. Right. And so I think it's important to sort of and again, it's important to sort of say, okay, is this an emergency? Right. And, there are ways to, and, to sort of, you can indicate who can come through on your do not disturb or not. But, I have my mom's the first person that's going to come through. But I think too, it's sort of, okay, what is this emergency? And then also, I think it's important to have conversations with your students and say, okay, if there's an emergency, I don't want to be the first person you call. Call your coach, call your trainer, and just make sure that you sort of have those conversations too, so that the student sort of has this sort of line of people that they may be able to go down through if there is, an emergency. So.
This dialogue. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Danny. No, go ahead.
Like 2 seconds. All I
Yeah,
was
please.
in response to the question, we can't necessarily make ourselves not feel, right? So we're not trying to say that the guilt doesn't exist, but we do get to decide how we manage it and what we do with it. So I think that's the important thing. It's not a bad thing you feel guilty, right? You're not bad for being a human and having emotions, or you're not doing anything wrong. And what you do with that is always in your power and your decision.
Yeah, the power of the and, right? That we can feel this way and also make a decision about how we're going to go forward. Some other things that I really wanted to re-highlight: the silence the inner critic, just to know that we can do both things, and also that we are worth setting boundaries. I love that you said that, and I'm gonna sing it forever. You are worth setting the boundary. Thank you, panelists and presenters, so much for all of your insightful responses and information. Rachel and Cecily, thank you for sharing all of the questions from the Q&A. On behalf of N4A and its leadership, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to be with us and to provide best practices for our membership. That concludes today's presentation. If you would, please take a few moments to complete the brief survey that will appear on the screen once the webinar has ended. If you'd like to contact any of our presenters, you can see our contact information is listed above. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and take care, everyone.